Chapter 1. The Wedding at St. Mildred's. The bells of St. Mildred's Church rang merrily across the rooftops of Little Dithering that morning, their chimes crisp in the late spring air. It was the sort of day people would remember, warm but not hot, skies clear as porcelain, hedgerows in full bloom. Even the crows, typically argumentative along the church spire, seemed to pause out of respect for the occasion. For Eleanor Hargreaves, eldest daughter of the well-established Hargreaves, family of Maple Lane, it was to be a perfect wedding. She had long been considered one of the village's prettiest girls, though more in the cool, polished style of a catalogue model than with any great warmth. And her groom, Mr. Lewis Dacres, was a respectable solicitor from Gillingham with ambitions toward the magistrate's bench. The entire village had been invited to the ceremony, and indeed it seemed that everyone had turned out. Farmers in freshly brushed coats, schoolchildren fidgeting in polished shoes, and church ladies with hats large enough to eclipse the sun. Among them, seated quietly in the second-to-last pew, was Miss Jane Marple. She was not close to the bride, nor particularly fond of the Hargreaves family, who, in Miss Marple's private estimation, had always shown a little too much concern with who sat at what table during church picnics. But she had known Eleanor's late grandmother, and had a kind invitation from Eleanor's mother, Mrs. Judith Hargreaves, handwritten in thick, slanting loops. It would have been impolite to decline. Miss Marple, though clad in a serviceable blue coat and a modest straw hat, noticed everything. She observed the bride's hands tremble slightly as she adjusted her veil, and how Mr. Dacres smiled more at the congregation than at Eleanor herself. She noticed a young man, barely more than a boy, standing stiffly in the shadows near the back, his eyes fixed on the altar with a burning intensity. And she noticed something else, something so subtle she might have missed it if she hadn't been glancing at the flowers. The bridal bouquet, though beautiful, an elegant gathering of white roses and freesia, was not the one that had been prepared by Mrs. Langton, the village florist. Mrs. Langton had told Miss Marple all about it over tea just the day before, cream peonies with eucalyptus sprigs, and just a touch of cornflower to match Eleanor's ribbon. She had been very proud of the arrangement, but the bouquet in Eleanor's hands had no peonies, no eucalyptus, and no cornflowers. It was elegant, yes, but distinctly different. Miss Marple tilted her head slightly, and her eyes narrowed just a fraction. The ceremony proceeded without interruption. Vows were exchanged, hymns sung, and confetti thrown with particular zeal by the children. Mr. and Mrs. Dacres were whisked into a silver Bentley belonging to the groom's firm, bound for the reception at the Hargreaves estate. But the undercurrent of tension, one that only the keenest observer might detect, had already begun to ripple through. The morning, Miss Marple chose to walk to the reception. She enjoyed the fresh air and the brief solitude to consider. A changed bouquet was not in itself cause for alarm. Perhaps there had been an error or an unfortunate mix-up. But Miss Marple had found, over many decades, that flowers had a language all their own. They concealed intentions, carried messages, and, on occasion, betrayed secrets. At the gate to the Hargreaves estate, Reverend Copley was already in conversation with several parishioners, discussing the choir's performance and offering general platitudes about young love. Inside the marquee, guests sipped champagne and commented on the layered sponge cake shaped like a country cottage. Mrs. Judith Hargreaves glided among the guests in mauve silk, flushed with pride and perhaps too much elderflower wine. Eleanor and Louis sat beneath a floral arch on an elevated dais, smiling politely and listening to a tedious speech from Louis's uncle, a retired colonel with a fondness for hunting anecdotes. Miss Marple declined the champagne and accepted a cup of tea from one of the uniformed servers. She sipped quietly near a hydrangea bush and watched. It was then that the bride's maid of honour, a pretty young woman named Teresa Langley, approached, her face pale and drawn. Miss Marple overheard her whisper urgently to Mrs. Hargreaves, "Judith, I don't know how it happened. The bouquet, it wasn't the one from Langton's. It was waiting on the side table in the sacristy, and when I went to get it, the first one had gone. There was only this." Mrs. Hargreaves frowned. "What are you saying? That someone replaced it?" Teresa bit her lip. "I don't know. But Eleanor said nothing, just took it like it didn't matter. But she looked, I don't know. Strange." Miss Marple's fingers tapped the side of her teacup. At that moment, a sudden cry went up from the far side of the marquee. Guests turned as a young girl, Annabel Pike, daughter of the village veterinarian, came running across the lawn, red-faced and crying. Behind her followed her mother, flustered and pale. "She's just had a fright," Mrs. Pike stammered. "Playing by the rose arch. She said, 'Oh, heavens!' She said there was a body." Silence fell. "A what?" gasped Mrs. Hargreaves. "I'm sure it's nonsense," Mrs. Pike insisted. "Children have imaginations." But even as she spoke, two of the men had already crossed the garden, rounded the hedge, and gasped. Minutes later, it was confirmed. There, among the roses behind the garden archway, lay the body of a woman. She was dressed in dark green. Her hands were gloved. Her eyes, wide and still, stared at the sky. And clutched in one hand was a single stem, a cornflower. Miss Marple placed her teacup gently on the table. So, the bouquet had been changed. Someone had died for it. Chapter 2. The Village Reacts. By Sunday morning, the village of Little Dithering was vibrating with tension beneath its placid smiles and pressed Sunday coats. The discovery of a body, and at a wedding no less, had the effect of stirring every cobwebbed corner of local memory, suspicion, and imagination. It was the kind of scandal people would pretend to be shocked by, while secretly savouring each new morsel of gossip as it surfaced. The body itself had been removed by tea-time the previous day, quietly transported in the undertaker's dark van, from behind the Hargreaves rose arch, and taken to the coroner's office in Much Wadden. Her identity had not been publicly confirmed, but by the time Miss Marple arrived at St. Mildred's for morning service, the whispers had already reached a fever pitch. She was the florist's assistant, young, blonde, terribly quiet. No, it was Eleanor's old school friend. There was always talk of a falling out. I heard she was the groom's former fiancée, come back to make a scene. And the bouquet, changed right before the ceremony, can you imagine? Miss Marple made her way to her usual pew with a calm expression and a folded handkerchief in her handbag. She noted as she passed the pinched look on Mrs. Hargreaves's face and the way Eleanor avoided everyone's gaze. The young bride sat perfectly still, as if carved in porcelain, but her fingers twitched restlessly in her lap. Lewis Dacres, the groom, wore an expression of uncomfortable distance, one Miss Marple had seen before on men accustomed to resolving unpleasantness with silence and signatures. When the Reverend began his sermon, it was on the subject of endurance through tribulation, which was widely interpreted, rightly or not, as a veiled address to the Hargreaves family. After the service, the courtyard outside the church buzzed with speculation. Miss Marple paused by the war memorial, where Teresa Langley, the maid of honour, stood pale and fretful. She started slightly when she saw Miss Marple. "Oh, Miss Marple, I didn't see you there. You've had quite a trying weekend, my dear," Miss Marple said kindly. "Would you care to walk with me a moment?" They strolled slowly down the lane, the sun warm on the hedges. "I can't stop thinking about the bouquet," Teresa admitted. "It was just there, on the table in the sacristy, and the one Mrs. Langton had made was gone." "Had you seen the original one beforehand?" Miss Marple asked. "Yes, I helped pick it up from the shop the day before. Cream peonies, cornflowers, and that trailing eucalyptus. It was beautiful. And the replacement?" Teresa frowned. "It was more formal, stiff, almost too elegant, no personality at all. Eleanor didn't seem to notice at first, but just after she took it, she looked odd, frightened almost." "Interesting," said Miss Marple. "Do you think the woman behind the arch was the one who made the switch?" "I think," Miss Marple said slowly, "that someone wanted Eleanor to receive that bouquet, and that someone went to great lengths to ensure it." That afternoon, Inspector Ainsley arrived from Much Wadden to take official charge of the investigation. He was a barrel-shaped man with a brisk manner, and no patience for what he called village embroidery. He interviewed the family first, then the serving staff, and finally the florist, Mrs. Langton, who confirmed that her assistant had placed the correct bouquet in the sacristy the evening before the wedding and locked the room behind her. "Duchev, you see your assistant again after that?" he asked. "No," she replied. "She left early, said she had a headache." "Would you describe her as reliable?" Mrs. Langton hesitated. "Quiet, kept to herself, but very good with flowers, creative even, and her name, Miss Clara Edevane. At last, the victim had a name." Miss Marple, listening just beyond the fence in the vicarage garden where the questioning had spilled, made a mental note. Clara Edevane, not local. That much was clear. No one had known her well, and the surname meant nothing to Miss Marple's long-cultivated memory of little Dithering's genealogies. That, in itself, was intriguing. By Monday, the coroner confirmed what some had already guessed. Clara Edevane had died of poisoning. A fast-acting agent, something botanical, possibly derived from a rare ornamental bloom. The bouquet itself was taken for analysis. That afternoon, Miss Marple paid a gentle visit to Mrs. Langton's shop. She browsed the petunias and lavender, asked after Mrs. Langton's arthritic knees, and only then inquired about Clara. "She came down from London in March," the florist said, eyes watery. "Said she needed quiet. She never said much, but she had a sadness about her, a gentle kind of grief. Did she receive any letters?" "A few, all from the same address, as far as I saw. Gillingham." Miss Marple nodded. Do you know if she ever spoke with Mr. Dacres? Lewis? Mrs. Langton frowned. No, though she did ask about the wedding more than once. I thought she was just being thorough. Miss Marple tilted her head. And did she ever take home arrangements? Once or twice. For practice, she said. She was working on a bridal spray just last week. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. And what flowers did she use? Mrs. Langton considered. Peonies, cornflower, eucalyptus, same as the one for Eleanor. Ah, said Miss Marple very softly. Of course. That evening Miss Marple sat quietly in her parlour with her knitting, reflecting on the small, precise facts as they had unfolded. A bride's bouquet swapped before the wedding. A woman found dead, holding a cornflower, the original bouquet missing. The bride's expression, the groom's detachment, a florist's assistant with a London past and Gillingham correspondence. And finally, the question no one had yet asked. Was Clara Eddervane the intended victim? Or had the bouquet been meant for someone else entirely? Miss Marple gave a small sigh. The flowers, as ever, were trying to speak. She just needed to listen more closely. Chapter 3. Early Investigation. The morning after the coroner's findings were quietly circulated among the inner circles of Little Dithering, Miss Marple paid a call to the vicarage under the pretence of delivering a jar of raspberry jam. Reverend Copley, though already deep in notes for Sunday's sermon, was kind enough to set his pen aside and pour her a cup of tea. "Have you had any thoughts about the funeral for the poor girl?" Miss Marple asked gently. The vicar sighed. "It's delicate. Clara Eddervane wasn't a parishioner, and the family, what there is of it, seems reluctant to claim the body. The authorities are still trying to reach someone in London. Her address was a boarding house." Miss Marple nodded. "No one has suggested a motive." The vicar blinked. "You think it was murder, Miss Marple?" She smiled faintly. "Poison, Reverend, tends not to apply itself." He paled slightly and reached for a biscuit. "And if the bouquet was the method, who was it meant for?" "That," said Miss Marple, "is what we must quietly consider." From the outside, the Hargreaves' estate looked unchanged, still prim, still manicured, still vaguely smug, but within its elegant walls there was unrest. Miss Marple arrived mid-morning and was shown in by the housekeeper, who whispered, "Mrs. Hargreaves is at the end of her tether, and the bride has barely eaten a thing." She found Judith Hargreaves in the drawing-room, seated beneath a painting of an indignant-looking ancestor, a half-drained cup of tea trembling slightly in her hand. "Miss Marple," she said, forcing a smile, "I suppose you've come to check on the grieving party." "I came," Miss Marple replied, "to bring a small arrangement from my garden. Rosemary, for remembrance." She handed the little nosegay across, and for a moment Judith looked down at the herbs as though they might sting. "Was Clara known to you at all?" Miss Marple asked delicately. Judith gave a small, hard laugh. "Barely. A florist's assistant, that's all. I saw her once or twice. Eleanor mentioned she was quiet, helpful. No one expected this." "And the bouquet, when did you first notice the switch?" "I didn't notice it at all. It was Teresa who told me after the ceremony. I had so much on my mind, I didn't think it mattered." Her voice faltered. "Do you think it mattered?" Miss Marple gave a small, non-committal smile. "Flowers are seldom random, dear, especially at weddings." Judith leaned back, suddenly tired. "I wanted this wedding to be perfect. I thought if Eleanor married well, with everything just so, then things might settle." "Things," Judith hesitated. Then, with a breath, "Eleanor was engaged once before, briefly. It ended badly. She's never spoken of it. Miss Marple's." Eyes flicked to the framed photograph of the bride and groom atop the mantel. "Was that suitor from Gillingham by chance?" Judith nodded. "Yes, but he left. Went abroad, I believe. I thought she'd moved past it. Do you know his name?" Judith pressed her lips together. "No, she never told me." Miss Marple said nothing, but she stored the information carefully. She found Teresa Langley later that afternoon at the Hargreaves' side garden, kneeling by the rose beds with her gloves smeared in soil. She looked up as Miss Marple approached and offered a wan smile. "I thought a bit of gardening might help," she said. "It's been such a horrid week." Miss Marple knelt beside her, knees creaking slightly. "Did you know Clara Eddervane?" Teresa shook her head. "No, only through the flowers. She was quiet, kind. I saw her at the shop once, the week before the wedding. She gave me a strange look." "What kind of look?" "As though she recognized me, but didn't expect to see me." Miss Marple said nothing for a moment. "She was from London, you know," she murmured, "but the letters she received at the shop came from Gillingham." Teresa's hands froze in the soil. Miss Marple went on gently. "Do you think it's possible Clara Eddervane came to Little Dithering not just for flowers, but to see someone? Someone she'd known in Gillingham?" Teresa didn't answer. Instead she said very quietly, "Eleanor wasn't always so composed. When we were at school, she used to cry at night. Said she'd made a terrible mistake, that someone would come back and ruin her." "Someone?" Teresa nodded. "She never said his name, but she wore a bracelet for a time. A plain silver one, engraved with initials. L.D. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, just slightly. "Like Louis Dacre's?" Teresa rose to her feet. "You mustn't ask her about it. She'll shut you out. She always does." Miss Marple stood too, brushing soil from her palms. "I don't intend to ask her, dear," she said gently. "I intend to find out what she won't say." That evening she sat with her knitting in the parlour, a single candle casting soft shadows across the room. She thought over the past day's events, the swapped bouquet, the cornflower in the dead woman's hand, the peculiar reactions of bride and groom. And she thought, too, of something deeper, something sadder. Miss Clara Eddervane had not come to Little Dithering merely to arrange flowers. She had come to warn someone, or to confront them, and someone, perhaps not the person she came for, had ensured her silence. Miss Marple picked up her pen and wrote 2 names on a slip of paper: Clara Eddervane, Eleanor Hargreaves. Then beneath them she wrote L.D. She paused, then added one more. Who was the bouquet meant for? Chapter 4. First Suspects. By Tuesday morning, Inspector Ainsley had fixed his attention on what he clearly believed was the most promising lead, Teresa Langley. "It's straightforward, really," he explained to the Reverend in front of the post office. His voice pitched low, but not quite low enough to avoid nearby ears. She had access to the bouquet, opportunity to swap it, and a connection to the bride, perhaps even jealousy. Miss Marple, passing at that very moment with a tin of scones for Mrs. Weatherby, paused just long enough to look mildly puzzled. "Jealousy?" she asked. The inspector cleared his throat, caught slightly off guard. "Maid of honour, unmarried, lives with an ageing aunt. A spinster's life, Miss Marple. One must admit it can chafe." Said Miss Marple politely. "Though in my experience it's more often the married who carry the sharpest resentments." She moved on without waiting for a reply, leaving the inspector to shift his feet awkwardly. It was the sort of thinking Miss Marple had encountered too many times before. Suspicion rooted in convenience, not observation. Teresa Langley had been nervous, yes, but not guilty. There was a sorrow in her expression, not malice. Miss Marple had seen it before, in war widows, in jilted lovers, in girls who had known too much and spoken too little. No, Teresa Langley may have had secrets, but she had not killed Clara Edevane, and the bouquet had not been switched by someone acting alone. Miss Marple's next visit was to the boarding house where Clara Edevane had lived for the past 3 months. It sat on the edge of Much Wadden, tucked between a shuttered tobacconist and an abandoned bakery. The landlady, Mrs. Minute, was a pink-cheeked woman with an overly curious manner and the habit of finishing every sentence with "poor girl." She was quiet, never brought gentlemen home, poor girl. Always paid her rent on time, poor girl. Had the look of someone waiting for a letter that never quite came, poor girl. Miss Marple listened patiently over a cup of overboiled tea and nodded at the appropriate moments. She kept a few books, a single suitcase, and a photograph on her nightstand. Mrs. Minute said, "I didn't look closely, of course, but it was a wedding photo." "Of herself?" Miss Marple asked. No, the bride was someone else. Couldn't quite see the faces. But she stared at it often. Mrs. Minute opened a drawer and pulled out a brown paper envelope. "The police didn't want this. Said they had what they needed, but I thought, well, you might know who to give it to." Inside was the photograph. Miss Marple unfolded it slowly. It showed a small group, likely taken at a wedding. The bride, elegant, familiar, was none other than Eleanor Hargreaves, a few years younger, standing beside a man who was most certainly not Louis Dacres. Beside them, a few guests posed with forced smiles, and off to the side, in the very edge of the frame, half in shadow, stood Clara Edevane. Miss Marple stared at it for a long time. The man beside Eleanor, tall, brown-haired, with a casual charm, was unknown to her, but the look on Clara's face was not merely wistful, it was protective. Miss Marple folded the photo gently and tucked it into her handbag. Another suitor, another story, another lie. That evening, Miss Marple paid a visit to the Hargreaves estate under the soft excuse of returning a handkerchief. She was led, not into the drawing-room, but to the back garden, where she found Eleanor seated alone beneath a white trellis. The bride wore no makeup. Her hands were wrapped around a teacup that had long since gone cold. Miss Marple sat beside her with quiet grace. "I was thinking," she said, "how lovely the peonies would have looked in your bouquet." Eleanor blinked. "Peonies?" The ones your mother ordered, the ones that were misplaced." Eleanor gave a brittle laugh. "Yes, a terrible mix-up." Miss Marple said nothing. Then, softly, "I wonder if it was really a mix-up, my dear, or if it was a message." Eleanor looked away. Miss Marple leaned just slightly forward. "You were engaged before, weren't you?" Eleanor stiffened. "It's not a scandal, you know," Miss Marple said kindly. "He was in the wedding photograph Clara kept." Eleanor swallowed. "His name was Thomas Reed. He worked in Gillingham. I was 19. We were going to run away. I thought it was love. What happened? He changed, became angry, jealous. He didn't like Clara. Said she was interfering. Was she? She was protecting me. She saw what I didn't. In the end, she convinced me to end it. She even wrote him a letter to tell him I'd left the country, that I was never coming back." Miss Marple waited. Eleanor's voice dropped. "But he came back. He found me, threatened me. Clara told him if he tried again, she'd go to the police." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "And did he?" "Yes, a few months ago. After Lewis and I announced our engagement, he sent a letter. I never opened it. Clara did. She told me not to worry, that she'd handle it." Eleanor's hands trembled. Now, she must have come here to stop him, or to stop something. Miss Marple exhaled slowly. "But the bouquet, my dear, was that your doing?" Eleanor shook her head. "No, I never saw it until the moment it was in my hands. But when I knew what? That he was here." Miss Marple's heart gave a quiet beat. "Thomas." Eleanor looked up, her voice little more than a breath. "He was the server at the wedding." Miss Marple's fingers tightened on the arm of the bench. "He was disguised, clean-shaven, hair darkened. But I recognized his eyes. Did anyone else? No, only Clara, I think. She must have tried to stop him." Miss Marple nodded slowly, and in her mind the pieces began to slot together with chilling clarity. A bouquet swapped with care. A message only one woman could read. A man bent on revenge, and a witness silenced before she could speak. Chapter 5. A Hidden Clue On. Wednesday morning, little Dithering woke to gentle rain, the kind that left lacework patterns on window panes, and softened the roads into damp quiet. The village seemed to breathe more slowly under its weight, as though it too was holding its breath for answers. Miss Marple, however, was already at her writing desk, with her spectacles perched low on her nose and a small notepad open before her. She reviewed her scribbled names and observations, each more entangled than the last. Clara Edevane had not died by accident. Of that she was now certain. Nor had the bouquet been a whim or prank. It had been a calculated substitution, one whose message had only been legible to a very select few. It was not just the flowers themselves that mattered, but how they were arranged. She remembered something Teresa Langley had said. It was more formal, stiffer, like it didn't have any heart. Miss Marple had seen the bouquet with her own eyes at the church. The composition was tightly symmetrical, almost regimented. White roses in 3 perfect rows, freesia tied with a stiff silver ribbon. But it was the leaves, not the flowers, that had caught her attention. The foliage was not the usual soft, sprays of fern or eucalyptus. It had been laurel, not common bay laurel from a kitchen garden, but a glossy, deep green variety, clipped into sharp, pointed tips. And it was that detail that sent her, hatless, into the rain, her umbrella forgotten by the door. Mrs. Langton's flower shop was empty at this hour, save for the faint smell of wet moss, and the ticking of the clock above the till. Miss Marple entered with her usual smile and nodded toward the back room. "I wonder if you might have a moment, dear." Mrs. Langton emerged, wiping her hands on a cloth. "Of course, Miss Marple. It's been a terrible week, hasn't it?" "Yes, and I'm afraid it's not quite done." She gestured toward the stack of green foliage on the cutting bench. "Would you mind telling me, did Clara ever use laurel? In her arrangements?" Mrs. Langton looked up in surprise. "Laurel? No, never. We don't even stock it. Too sharp and it wilts poorly. But I did see some clippings in the bin the other day. I assumed one of the boys brought it in from the hedge. May I see the bin?" Mrs. Langton obliged, leading her to the rear garden. There, behind the composting corner, sat a shallow tin container, half full of stems, twine, and offcuts. Miss Marple bent down, drew out a length of laurel, and studied it, still fresh, still glossy. She straightened, eyes sharp behind her lenses. Someone, not Clara, had used laurel, and laurel, as every gardener knew, could be dangerous. That afternoon, Miss Marple made a quiet visit to the chemist's shop, under the modest pretence of picking up cough lozenges for the vicar's wife. The chemist, Mr. Daltrey, was a stooped man with excellent memory, and a tendency to chatter when prompted. "Oh, yes, we've had a few queries about poisons lately," he said when Miss Marple casually inquired whether anyone had requested unusual compounds. "Rat poison, mostly. Oh, and one gentleman came in asking about laurel leaves." Miss Marple's hand paused on the countertop. "Did he now?" "Yes. Wanted to know if they were as dangerous as people say." I told him, well, certainly the cherry laurel variety produces cyanide compounds if crushed improperly. He seemed very interested. "And did he give his name?" The chemist hesitated. "Said he was visiting from out of town. Dark hair, clean-shaven, polite, but unnerving." Miss Marple nodded gently. "Did he by chance purchase anything?" "A small bottle of essential oil. Didn't say what for." Miss Marple thanked him and left, and as she stepped into the drizzle, the last fragment of doubt left her mind. The bouquet had been dosed, and the killer had masked it behind tradition, behind white roses and silver ribbon, and the expectations of a bride. But someone else had picked it up first. Someone else had died instead. That evening, Miss Marple visited Teresa Langley once more. She found her on the back steps of her cottage, nursing a cup of tea. "I needed the quiet," Teresa said softly, making room. Miss Marple sat beside her. "I believe Clara Edevane was murdered," she said gently. Teresa froze. "And I believe she wasn't the intended victim." Teresa turned. "Then who?" Miss Marple looked at her. "You know who." Teresa blinked and her composure broke. "She told me she'd come to warn Eleanor," she said, her voice cracking, "that someone from her past had returned. She didn't name him, but I saw the fear in her eyes. She met him at the wedding, didn't she?" Teresa nodded. "She said she recognized one of the waiters. He'd changed his name, darkened. His hair, but she knew. She must have confronted him," Miss Marple said quietly. and he must have acted swiftly. Teresa clutched her teacup. The bouquet? It was meant for Eleanor, wasn't it? Yes. Poisoned with laurel, likely the oil rubbed onto the leaves or the ribbon where the bride would hold it. Enough to seep through the skin over time. A slow but fatal dose. Teresa was shaking. She must have picked it up by mistake. Miss Marple touched her hand gently. She may have saved Eleanor's life, and paid for it with her own. That night, Miss Marple sat once again at her writing desk and made a single addition to her list: Thomas Reed, a.k.a. Mr. Granger, server at the wedding. Clean-shaven, darkened hair, no photographs taken that day. Chemist confirms query. Cherry laurel and essential oils. Photograph in Clara's boarding house confirms link. The killer had blended in beautifully, but there had been one miscalculation. He had underestimated the dead, and he had underestimated Miss Marple. Chapter 6. Confrontations and Secrets. The next morning arrived clear and bright, a deceptive calm after days of creeping tension. In Little Dithering, the usual routines resumed. The baker's boy whistled on his round, the church bell tolled for morning prayers, and the village green sparkled with dew. But underneath it all was a sense of growing unease. Something had shifted. At Fernbrook Cottage, Miss Marple dressed with her usual care, added a final stitch to the edge of a baby bonnet she'd been working on for the vicar's niece, and prepared to make 2 very specific calls. She began with Lewis Dacres. The groom had been notably absent from village view since the reception, choosing instead to remain at the Hargreaves estate under the pretext of assisting with legal correspondence concerning the investigation. Miss Marple was received in the Hargreaves library, where Lewis sat at the wide oak desk, his sleeves rolled and his collar slightly loosened, a man trying to appear unbothered. "Miss Marple," he said with forced politeness, "I trust you haven't come to question me." "Oh, no," she replied pleasantly. "I've come to ask for your expertise." That made him blink. "I understand Clara Eddervane once worked in Gillingham. You used to practice there, didn't you?" "I did," he said slowly, "but I don't recall anyone of that name." "How unfortunate," said Miss Marple, extracting a folded photograph from her handbag. "Perhaps this will jog your memory." She placed the photo on the desk. The wedding group, Eleanor in her earlier days, a tall man by her side, and Clara half shrouded on the edge. Lewis glanced at it, then looked away. "I don't see how this is relevant. I believe Clara may have been connected to someone from your past, someone Eleanor once knew, someone who posed as a server at your wedding." His fingers tensed. "Are you suggesting I had anything to do with that?" "I'm suggesting," Miss Marple said mildly, "that secrets tend to ferment, and people who hide their past must be very careful not to mistake a church aisle for a clean slate." Lewis rose, pushing his chair back with deliberate calm. I believe this conversation is inappropriate." "I imagine a murder at your wedding might be considered rather more inappropriate," she replied, rising with perfect grace. "But do forgive me. I'm only a spinster with roses and suspicions." She let herself out, but she did not leave the grounds. Instead, she found Eleanor in the back garden again, this time trimming the hedge with mechanical movements. Her gloves were too thin for the work, and her knuckles were raw. Miss Marple approached, slowly. I think it's time someone told you the truth." Eleanor lowered the shears. "I think I've known it longer than I've admitted." Miss Marple waited. Eleanor's voice was low. "Clara was more than a friend. She was my shield. When Thomas and I ended, she kept the letters. Told him I was abroad. When he found out I was engaged to Lewis, she panicked. Why? Because she didn't trust Lewis either. She'd heard rumours about his past, how he left Gillingham under awkward circumstances." Miss Marple nodded. "There was a minor scandal, I believe, involving forged signatures on property contracts. It never reached the court. Quietly dismissed." Eleanor gave a hollow laugh. "Father said it didn't matter. Lewis was respectable. His firm handled our affairs. He was safe, but Clara disagreed." Eleanor looked up, finally meeting Miss Marple's eyes. "She came here to warn me. She said someone was dangerous, but I thought she meant Thomas. I didn't understand until it was too late." "She gave you the bouquet," Miss Marple said, gently, or tried to, but someone intercepted it. "She picked it up herself, and died in my place," Eleanor whispered. The wind stirred the hedge leaves. Miss Marple touched her arm. "And now, my dear, I believe someone is trying to ensure that you never find out the full truth." Miss Marple's second visit that day was to Inspector Ainsley, who greeted her with thin patience and a cup of tea that tasted faintly of chalk. "I've no evidence pointing to anyone new," he said. "Our main suspect, Thomas Reed was it, has vanished. No known address, no records since 1937. Miss Marple reached into her handbag and pulled out a second folded page. It was a staffing list for the catering company used at the wedding, which she had obtained from the vicar's wife, who had helped organize the event. Among the names, some genuine, some borrowed, was one Peter Granger. "Cross-reference that," she said quietly, "with any known aliases for Thomas Reed. He used that name when he registered at the village inn. He was in Little Dithering, likely hiding in plain sight." The inspector took the paper, read it, then glanced up with new attention. Miss Marple continued, "And I believe he was not working alone." "What do you mean?" "I believe someone told him when Clara would be alone, when the bouquet would be unguarded. Perhaps someone who didn't know what he planned, only that they wanted her out of the way." The inspector stared at her. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Murder often begins in fear, Inspector, but it flourishes in opportunity." That evening, as dusk fell over the village, Miss Marple sat by her fire and watched the coals flicker like red blossoms in the grate. She no longer needed confirmation of the killer, but she did need to know who had opened the sacristy door that morning, who had let Thomas Reed into the church, and above all, why. The answers, she knew, lay not in fingerprints or footprints, but in guilt. And guilt had a way of revealing itself, not in speech, but in silence. Chapter 7. Another Twist. The following morning, the village awoke to an unsettling announcement. Teresa Langley, maid of honour, trusted confidant and long-time family friend, was missing. Her aunt, Mrs. Godfrey, reported that her bed had not been slept in, and a note had been left on the breakfast table. "I need time to think. Don't worry. Please don't try to find me." The note, written in Teresa's careful script, was unsigned. There were no signs of struggle, no packed bags missing, just the faint scent of lavender water in the air, and a growing sense that something had gone terribly wrong. Miss Marple received the news with the quiet gravity of someone who had, regrettably, anticipated it. She knew something, she said, to herself, gently setting her teacup down. Or she feared someone had realized that she did. She reached for her gloves and hat. It was time to speak to Cordelia Hargreaves. Miss Marple found the bride's mother pacing the edge of the fern-lined veranda, her usual composure visibly cracked. A servant offered tea, which Cordelia waved, away with a trembling hand. "She's gone?" she repeated. "But why would Teresa run?" "That," said Miss Marple, "is precisely the question I've come to ask." Cordelia exhaled sharply. She adored Eleanor, as since they were girls. There's nothing she wouldn't do for her. "Yes," Miss Marple said gently, "including keep secrets. And now, perhaps, carry burdens not her own." Cordelia looked away. "Mrs. Hargreaves," Miss Marple continued, "did you notice anything unusual in the days before the wedding? Any conversation, however passing, that might seem different in retrospect?" There was a long silence. Then, the night before the wedding, I heard voices near the study. I thought it was the servants. But when I stepped out, I saw Teresa shutting the sacristy key drawer. I asked what she was doing. She said she was checking where to leave the bouquet on the morning of the ceremony. I didn't think anything of it. Miss Marple nodded slowly. "And did anyone else have access to that drawer?" Cordelia hesitated. "Only Lewis. He used it to lock up the wedding documents after rehearsal." Miss Marple pressed no further, but her mind turned. 2 people, both of whom had access to the sacristy key. 2 people, both loyal to Eleanor in different yet intense ways. And only one bouquet, one switch, one death. At the post office, Miss Marple caught the tail end of a conversation between Mr. Elcott, the butcher, and Mrs. Vane, who had recently installed a wireless she claimed picked up Paris. "I told you, Teresa was seen arguing with someone 2 days ago," Mrs. Vane whispered, her knitting bag clutched close. "Outside the flower shop. Raised voices." "Could have been about anything," Mr. Elcott muttered. Miss Marple, with her usual disarming smile, approached. "Do you happen to know who she was speaking with?" Mrs. Vane blinked, surprised. "Well, I suppose it's not gossip if you're asking, Miss Marple. It was Louis Dacres. Quite animated he was." She looked upset. Miss Marple thanked her, offered a few polite comments about rhubarb, and left. Her suspicions had finally taken form. Teresa Langley had known something. Not just about Thomas Reed, but about Louis. She had threatened to speak, or had tried to warn Eleanor again, and now she was gone. But whether she had vanished out of guilt or fear remained to be seen. That evening, Miss Marple returned to her own drawing-room and summoned Inspector Ainsley. She presented him with her notes and a sequence of facts laid out as clearly as one might list the ingredients of a pudding Clara. Edivane had once protected Eleanor from Thomas Reed. Reed had resurfaced at the wedding under a false name. The bouquet, likely poisoned with laurel oil, was placed in the sacristy with the intention of reaching Eleanor. Clara picked it up instead, and died. Teresa Langley had knowledge of the sacristy key's location, and a history of protective loyalty. Louis Disappearance had a shadowed past and a motive to suppress scandal. Teresa and Louis were seen arguing days before the wedding. Teresa vanished after Clara's murder began unravelling. The inspector looked troubled. "You're suggesting Teresa was involved?" "I'm suggesting," Miss Marple said carefully, "that the switch may not have been made by Thomas Reed at all. That someone else may have ensured the poisoned bouquet was waiting for Eleanor. And Clara walked into it by accident. Yes." The inspector sat back. "You believe Teresa made the switch. I believe she may have been manipulated, pressured, possibly by Louis, possibly by a misguided sense of protection. But her disappearance suggests she knew something dangerous. And now she's silenced herself before anyone else could." Inspector Ainsley rubbed his temples. "We've had no report of Teresa leaving the village, no sightings." Miss Marple's gaze grew sharper. "Then I suggest," she said quietly, "we begin searching the woods near the vicarage path." The inspector looked up. "Why there?" Miss Marple folded her hands. "Because Teresa took that path often when walking home, and because those who carry guilt often return to the places where they last felt safe. The search began that night. By lantern light and constables with flash lamps, they combed the wooded footpath behind the church, where hedgerows pressed thick and the earth grew soft from the rain. Just before midnight, a gloved hand parted the ferns and revealed a figure curled at the base of a willow, soaked to the bone, pale as paper. Teresa Langley, alive but unconscious, and clutched in her hand was a folded page, damp, smeared with ink, and torn from a wedding programme. Miss Marple read it the next morning. "He said it would only frighten her, that she wouldn't be hurt. I should have known better. I didn't mean for her to die. I only wanted to protect Eleanor. I didn't know the bouquet was poisoned. There was no signature. But there didn't need to be." Chapter 8. Miss Marple's final test. By midday, Teresa Langley had been moved to a quiet room at the vicarage under the care of Reverend Copley's wife, who administered weak broth and frequent reassurances in equal measure. The doctor confirmed she had suffered exhaustion, exposure, and what he gently called an acute emotional collapse. But she would recover. Miss Marple, however, was less interested in the diagnosis than the note Teresa had left behind. Creased and damp, but unmistakably damning. He said it would only frighten her, that she wouldn't be hurt. I should have known better. She did not name Louis Dacres, but the implication hung like low fog over the village. The question was no longer whether Louis was involved. It was how to prove it, and ensure no more damage could be done. And for that, Miss Marple required one last conversation. She found Louis Dacres in the village library that afternoon, seated at the far table with an open legal journal before him, and a performance of calm that was growing less convincing by the day. "Miss Marple," he said smoothly, standing as she approached. "Come to borrow the Law Times, have you?" She smiled. "Only if it contains case law on the subject of poisonous shrubs and unintended murder." He froze for a beat too long before composing himself. "Still on the business of the bouquet, I see. It's a tragic misunderstanding, that much is clear. Is it?" she asked gently. "Because I find it rather complex. The bouquet was altered. A rare kind of laurel was used in place of the eucalyptus. Laurel that releases cyanide when crushed." He said nothing, she continued, and the florist's assistant who died, Clara, was never meant to receive it. The target was likely the bride, but the bouquet was picked up prematurely. He gave a tight smile. All speculation, Miss Marple. Oh, certainly, she agreed. Speculation that's led to a missing woman, a poisoned bouquet, a murdered assistant, and curiously, your complete absence from photographs on your own wedding day. His jaw tensed. I avoid photographs, he said coolly. Yes, Miss Marple murmured. So do men with records under other names. That struck a nerve. For the briefest moment, his eyes narrowed, and a flush crept up his neck. Miss Marple let the silence sit between them for a beat, then softened her tone. You know, she said, I once saw a fox cornered in a garden shed. Looked harmless, right until it wasn't. Lewis took a breath. If you have something to accuse me of, I'm an old woman, Miss Marple said with a small shrug. I don't accuse, I observe. She turned to go, then stopped. Oh, one last thing. Teresa's awake now, and she's talking. His expression flickered. And that, Miss Marple thought as she walked out, was the only confirmation she needed. By evening, she had convened a quiet gathering at the vicarage. Inspector Ainsley, Eleanor, Mrs. Hargreaves, and a visibly weakened but resolute Teresa Langley propped on pillows. Lewis had not been invited, not yet. I wanted us all to understand the truth, Miss Marple began, hands folded neatly, because silence has done enough harm. She turned to Eleanor first. You were nearly killed by your bouquet, my dear. But the weapon wasn't forged in haste. It was prepared. Someone with knowledge, botanical and chemical, applied laurel oil to the stems and ribbon. Enough to kill through repeated contact. Eleanor stared at her lap. But Clara died instead. Yes, because she touched the bouquet first in the sacristy. But someone knew when the flowers would be alone. Someone with the key. Someone who also knew the schedule, when Teresa would fetch them. Someone who could swap them unnoticed. She looked to the inspector. That person was Lewis Dacus. Ainsley nodded slowly. We've confirmed that a man using the name Peter Granger, matching Lewis's build and hair, checked into the Red Fox Inn 2 weeks prior. He never used his real name. Miss Marple continued. And that man had once been involved in a scandal in Gillingham. One Clara likely knew about, possibly helped cover up. That would explain her presence here. She didn't come just to arrange flowers. She came to protect Eleanor again. Teresa stirred weakly. He told me it was a joke, that he wanted to scare Clara. He made me believe it was just theatre. I didn't know the bouquet was poisoned. But he did, Miss Marple said, and he counted on your loyalty, on your fear. Teresa covered her face with her hands. Miss Marple stood and addressed the room. I asked Lewis to meet me at Fernbrook Cottage this evening. I expect he'll come. Ainsley nodded. I'll be there, with Constable Farrow. Miss Marple turned to Eleanor. You must stay behind, dear. You've had enough pain. But I promise you, by tonight, this will be over. Eleanor said nothing, but her eyes filled with quiet tears. An hour later, Miss Marple sat calmly in her parlour with a small tea tray, the door left slightly ajar. She did not look up when Lewis Dacus stepped in. I hear Teresa's talking, he said, his voice tight. What did she say? Miss Marple gestured to the seat opposite her. She told me the truth. But I needed to see whether you'd come." Lewis frowned. "What do you mean?" "I needed to know whether guilt had begun to catch up with you, or whether you still thought yourself clever enough to bluff through it." She poured tea. "You poisoned the bouquet," she said plainly. "Clara got there first, and then Teresa, bless her loyal soul, became an inconvenience. So you told her just enough to keep her compliant." He didn't respond, so she added, "She kept the key, didn't she? But you asked for it the night before the wedding, said you needed it for the documents." Still nothing. But his fingers began to curl into fists. "I'm afraid," she said gently. "It's over now." Footsteps approached behind him. Inspector Ainsley and the constable stepped into view. Lewis turned, face pale, and in that moment all cleverness fled. He did not resist. By dawn, the arrest had been made. Miss Marple stood at her garden gate, breathing in the fresh morning air. Behind her, the kettle whistled gently. The roses nodded in the breeze, unaware of the tragedy that had passed so near their roots. She smiled faintly, then turned inside. A life had been lost, another saved, and yet another, perhaps Eleanor's, set free. But Miss Marple knew, as always, that human nature rarely changes. There would be more secrets, more lies, and more bouquets, beautiful and dangerous, hiding thorns beneath their petals. Chapter 9. The Reveal. By Friday afternoon, the worst of the storm had passed. Not a literal storm, for the skies above Little Dithering were now a placid blue, but rather the invisible, oppressive weight that had pressed down over the village. Since the fateful wedding, news of Lewis Dacre's arrest had travelled quickly. Not in scandalous headlines or shouted accusations. Little Dithering didn't operate that way. But in dropped spoons, widened eyes, and murmured phrases like, "I never quite trusted him," and "he always looked right through you." At Fernbrook Cottage, Miss Marple received a modest stream of visitors. But it wasn't until the early evening that she convened her own quiet gathering. Eleanor Hargreaves, pale but composed, sat beside her mother on the sofa. Teresa Langley, still recovering, remained seated near the hearth, her hands wrapped tightly around a teacup. Inspector Ainsley stood at the back, arms folded, nodding silently as Miss Marple rose. "I believe," she said gently, "that we now understand how poor Clara Eddervane came to lose her life, and how close we came to seeing another tragedy entirely." No one spoke, so she continued. Clara was not simply a florist's assistant. She had known Eleanor during a particularly vulnerable period of her life. She was there when Eleanor ended her engagement to Thomas Reed, a man whose temper, possessiveness, and eventual threats led Clara to intervene. Clara protected Eleanor once before, and when she heard of her renewed engagement to Lewis Dacre's, she came to protect her again. Eleanor nodded slowly, face unreadable. Lewis, Miss Marple said, had more to lose than pride. His past in Gillingham involved professional misconduct, allegedly forging documents to obtain land under a false name. The matter was hushed, thanks in part to connections Eleanor's family held, but the incident never left him. "And Clara knew?" Teresa asked faintly. "Yes," said Miss Marple. "She kept the evidence, or at least claimed to. I suspect she never truly intended to expose him. But her presence here was a threat. Lewis knew that if Clara spoke up, the marriage would end, And worse, the police might finally connect him to Thomas Reed's old aliases. Inspector Ainsley added, "We found documents linking Lewis to Reed's employment during that period. They were associates. Possibly more. If Thomas is still alive, he's keeping well hidden." Miss Marple nodded. "But what we know is this. Someone altered the bridal bouquet. The laurel leaves, chosen deliberately, were laced with essential, oil extracted from cherry laurel, a substance known to release cyanide compounds." She turned to Eleanor. "That bouquet was meant for you, my dear." Eleanor looked down, fingers tightening on the hem of her skirt. But Clara, bless her, picked it up first, either out of concern or accident. And it killed her. Miss Marple turned to Teresa. And someone knew the bouquet had been switched. Someone who had access to the sacristy key, which was left in a drawer only Lewis and Teresa used in the days leading to the wedding. Teresa's voice cracked. "He said it was just to frighten her, that she was trying to ruin Eleanor's future. I didn't know it was poison." Miss Marple's eyes were kind. "You were manipulated, dear. You saw someone hurting your friend and believed you were stopping it." A pause. "And I believe that after Clara died, Lewis feared you would speak. That's why he tried to isolate you, keep you frightened, until finally the pressure broke you." Teresa wiped her eyes. "I went to the woods because I didn't know what else to do. I didn't want to live with it, but I couldn't let him lie any more." Miss Marple walked over and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "Truth," she said softly, "finds its way, even when we try to bury it beneath petals." Inspector Ainsley stepped forward. "We've confirmed Clara's belongings included a letter addressed to Eleanor. It was never delivered. Inside, she warned of Lewis's past and expressed fear that someone was following her. She wrote, 'If anything happens to me, check the bouquet.' Eleanor paled. 'I never saw it.' 'Because Lewis intercepted it,' Miss Marple said, 'just as he intercepted the bouquet, knowing it would be your undoing if you discovered what Clara had learned.' Mrs. Hargreaves, silent until now, finally spoke. 'I vouched for him. I introduced him to Eleanor. I thought I was securing her future.' Miss Marple sat beside her. 'You were protecting your daughter in the only way you knew how. But sometimes protection becomes a kind of blindness. Lewis wore the right suits and used the right words, but he had the wrong soul.' A heavy silence followed. Then Miss Marple stood. 'There is one final truth,' she said, her voice clear, 'and it belongs to Clara.' She retrieved the folded photograph from her handbag, the wedding image, faded but powerful, and placed it on the table. She was watching all along, from the edge, keeping guard. They all leaned in. The moment lingered, not as grief, but as recognition. Clara had not died in vain. She had fulfilled her purpose, even in silence. That night, Miss Marple sat by the fire with her knitting, the needles clacking rhythmically. She sipped a cup of warm milk and listened to the peaceful creak of the house settling around her. Outside, little Dithering had begun to exhale. In the days to come, the scandal would soften. The florist's shop would reopen. Eleanor, it was, said might go away for a time, perhaps to Cornwall. And Teresa Langley would quietly begin volunteering at the parish school, a gentle penance that no one requested but everyone understood. And Miss Marple, She would tend to her roses and wait, because even in the most peaceful villages, human nature never truly rests. Chapter 10. Aftermath. It was nearly a week before the village of Little Dithering returned to its customary rhythms. Not because it had forgotten, but because it had, very deliberately, decided not to speak of the events surrounding the Hargreaves' wedding. The villagers, in their uniquely English way, preferred the illusion of calm to the drama of reflection. The flowers at St. Mildred's were changed by the end of the week, the last trace of the wedding bouquet quietly replaced with daffodils and sweet alyssum. Mrs. Langton restocked her window display with cautious optimism. And Eleanor Hargreaves, her engagement ring quietly removed, retreated to her aunt's cottage in Devon for a season of rest. As for Louis Dacus, he had been taken under police custody without resistance. His trial, when it came, would be held far from the eyes of Little Dithering, where his true identity, past aliases, and connection to Thomas Reed would be laid bare. But within the village, a strange peace settled, like something that had been held too long, finally let go. Miss Marple, for her part, made no dramatic pronouncements, offered no grand conclusions. She declined offers of thanks, deflected praise, and returned to her knitting as though nothing had happened at all. But anyone watching closely might have noticed that she walked the village lanes a little more slowly now, pausing to look at hedgerows and front gardens, observing not just what was there, but what was missing. On Thursday morning she visited Clara Edivane's grave. A small, modest headstone had been placed at the far end of the churchyard. No family had come forward. The stone read only, "Clara Edivane, beloved friend." She kept her promise. 1911, even 1939 Miss Marple knelt to place a single stem of cornflower beside it. She saw what others didn't, she murmured, and acted on it. That's rarer than people think. A rustle behind her. She turned to see Teresa Langley, bundled in her coat, her expression subdued. "I come here sometimes," Teresa said, "to talk to her. Silly, I know." "Not silly at all," Miss Marple replied gently. "The dead often understand us better than the living." They stood in silence for a time. Then Teresa asked, "Will people forgive me, do you think?" Miss Marple looked at her kindly. "In time, perhaps, but more importantly, you must forgive yourself." Teresa nodded, eyes fixed on the stone. "I thought I was helping. I just wanted to keep Eleanor safe." "You did," Miss Marple said softly. "And so did Clara. But the person you must protect now is yourself." They said no more. And that was enough. Later that evening, over a cup of tea in her front parlour, Miss Marple finally allowed herself a moment of reflection. She pulled out the now wrinkled photograph of the earlier wedding, the one Clara had kept, the one that had helped unlock it all. Eleanor smiling unaware, Clara on the edge of the frame. Not posing, not intruding, watching. A quiet figure on the margins of someone else's happiness, trying to protect it. Willing to be forgotten so long as no one else was hurt. It was that kind of selflessness, Miss Marple thought, that often went unremarked. The kind that left no monument, no family name, but still, in the end, shaped lives in ways loud heroism never could. She folded the photograph away. Outside, the breeze moved gently through the hedges. The bridal bouquet was long gone, but its memory remained. in the questions it raised, in the truths it exposed, and in the lives it changed. It had begun with flowers, and it had ended in silence. But in that silence, justice had bloomed. As Miss Marple stood to draw her curtains, for the night she allowed herself the smallest of smiles. Because for all the secrets people thought they could hide behind pleasantries and petals, flowers always tell the truth.